introduce yourself?
No.
No? Alright. He's a stranger.
No,
You have
yeah.
to connect to their way.
That might help.
For meetup, password is August 20.
August 20th. For more, please.
Give it a minute.
There you go.
So, my name is Peter. I wiggle. My name is Peter. I do a thing or two at Piotr. I'm gonna quickly introduce a gem that we made for ourselves called the Special Writer.
Wow.
So it even has a readme with install instructions. That's really great. We're proud of the install instructions. But maybe before I start talking about it, because I mean at the core it's nothing all that different from Rescue or whatever. I'll get down to why we wrote our own queue system. So for the longest time we used delay jump. Worked okay, until it stopped working.
Does that feel?
It basically does a great job if you're running fairly small scale. But the moment you start throwing a bunch of servers simultaneously pulling stuff off of the queue and a whole bunch of stuff is going on, it just fails fairly miserably. So we were fairly invested into Amazon, so we used basically anything they got, and they have this thing called SQS, which is their simple queuing service. And they have this other thing called SNS, which is called simple notification service. So the idea was that we would use SNS as a means of dispatching the messages. So you basically, in SNS you create a topic, and in the topic you subscribe a bunch of people to it. In this case, our people are actual SQS queues. So we have a topic, say for example, clocking created, and one of our applications posts a message to that saying, hey, clocking was just created, here's the details.
Group chat.
And then we have a bunch of subscribers to that topic. One is the application that deals with attendance. So that comes in and that shows up with the managers, and managers go, okay, oh, this guy was late or absent or whatever. And then we have a separate app that deals with verifying people's actual faces, because Hero does the biometric through facial recognition, so we have a separate thing that we have a separate service that deals with that, and that's completely separate from the rest of everything. So, anyways, one message goes into SNS. SNS goes, cool, there's two things subscribed to it, I'm just going to send it out to two of them, and then it ends up in an SQS queue. At the time, I don't know that that's probably different by now, but at the time there was nothing really, there was no gem that just pulls shit off of SQS queues and runs jobs. So we wrote one ourselves. Fairly simple at its core, just kind of grew in complexity over time. And that's this Special Writer. The Special Writer has two parts. The publishing part, where you send messages to an SNS topic, and the subscribing part, where you subscribe to, in this case, an SQS queue, and you pull off messages with it and you work them off. Pretty sure that's in the README. Let's see.
Yeah.
So publishing, so you do a bunch of configuration, you set up the publisher, and you set up the notification services. There's a basic driver in this thing for the file system, so we can actually run tests against this thing. So it uses a folder as a queue. It puts messages as files in the folder and picks up the stuff.
Change this extension. Yeah,
works great for testing. And Nico was saying it signals the status of the file with just the extensions like .ready means it's ready to go, dot in progress, dot done. So this is just the examples. You use that. So you set up that, or you use the configuration syntax. That's something that you can just drop into initializer or anywhere else, for example.
You go and copy pasted.
This is not. This thing was not really like it's like sort of potentially available to the public, but we haven't really groomed it for being a public jet. So. Anyway, so you can publish messages. At the very raw version of this, you basically just publish with a subject of something and a body of some additional data. There we go. We have the actual publisher base class you can use, and that cleans up a bunch of that stuff. And you set up the destination as the subject, and just publish with a bunch of parameters, and off it goes.
No, no, okay. Just many subscribers as you want.
Then subscribers are the other side of it. So this is something you should again shove into the initializer. You have a bunch of configures, so you can actually have folks around before and after and all that. For example, in Rails, we throw a database transaction around the execution of the job. In cases you may not want to do that. It has its own logger, which you configure to Rails logger in this case. Error handler, default error handler just raises it, but we wrote modules for plugging into something like Bugsnag.
It not only supports SQS.
QKind right now, well,
File
system.
File system.
So basically, so QKind and handle path is basically it's going to look into that folder and find all the different essentially job types that you can run. Callbacks, manual setup. Anyway, so that's a
handler.
That's a handler. Much like most other jobs type things, you just create a little class image and put a process message, and you do whatever you want with it. With an extra thing, we're having a required timeout option where, well, SQS has the capability of deferring a job, so basically if it fails, it's going to queue it up to only be available in 10 minutes, that way it doesn't just keep chain failing and stuff. Yeah, and we have a bunch of extra stuff we added in for being able to extend the time. Like the SQS has a facility in it where if you pick up a job to work on it, it gives you, you configure on the queue level what the default timeout is, but for that duration of the default timeout, you own the job. But if the default timeout runs out, that job becomes available for other people to pick it up again. So you want to make sure that you complete the execution of it within the default timeout, or you make sure that you extend it while you're running the job so that you keep ownership of that job. Because otherwise you might have crashed and you want to release it to be able to actually run it again and maybe succeed this time. So this is just a facility we have for extending a timeout so that you have a long loop or something in there. You can refresh that every 2 hours or whatever you want to do. And we air brake we no longer use. I believe that's now replaced with Bugsnag. But yeah, and that's it. It's open source. It's not used by anybody other than us, but feel free to try it. It's running all of our production queues, so it's fairly stable. There you go.
If you want to build a Redis backend to us, feel free. You can tell us when you do.
We might need it.
Yeah, so you can.
And it's just hero/dispatchwriter.
What I'm not familiar with SQS here. What crucial the path like to notify workers?
The messages are pulled from the queue actively by the worker.
Okay.
So there's no.
So it's like HTTP.
Well, yeah, you just use the Amazon client library.
Okay.
Questions? Other questions? Pizza?
Pizza.
Is that functionality part of the job?
Yeah. So the publishing part of it puts the jobs on, and the subscribing part pulls them off and puts them on. So there's a full. They call it the. I forget what the pattern for it was, but basically there's a loop. Well, the pub sub is on the one side, but it's called the reactor pattern. Okay. Anyways, basically there's a thing that there's an activation that pulls the jobs off. There's a registry of the different job types that you can run. It looks them up in the registry. Calls the right handler with the message, and that's the next one.
It also accomplishes good division of responsibilities between
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hindi na sinini.
It forces you to decouple your.
It's like,
Not
Oh,
just-
and it has tests too.
Yeah.
We actually do a fairly decent job of being tested in our code base, so this just kind of follows the rest of it.
Thanks.